Prince Harry is back in the UK, and the timing alone tells you this is not a sentimental return. This is not a quiet family visit or a reflective moment. This is urgency disguised as normality. For years, Harry positioned himself as the man who escaped, the royal who broke free from tradition, hierarchy, and the institution he repeatedly described as cold and damaging. He built an entirely new identity around rejection of that world. And yet, when pressure mounted, when something far bigger than bad press began to move behind the scenes, he didn't call a Hollywood crisis manager. He didn't release a statement. He didn't sit down for another interview. He went back to the one place he once said he never needed again. People don't return to systems they publicly dismantled unless the alternative is worse. And whatever Harry is facing now is not something that can be softened with public sympathy or polished language. It's not a scandal that fades with time. It's the kind of situation where silence becomes valuable again, where protection matters more than pride. That alone changes how this story should be understood. The reason for that urgency does not begin in Montecito or London. It begins in a prison cell in Florida, where Ghislaine Maxwell is serving a lengthy federal sentence. Her social power is gone, her network has collapsed, her future is sealed. And that's exactly why her position has shifted. People remain quiet when they still have something to lose. When the leverage is gone, silence stops being useful. According to the narrative now circulating in legal and media circles, Maxwell has begun speaking in detail, not vaguely, not hypothetically, but directly. Names, locations, patterns. And when someone with first-hand knowledge decides to talk, the consequences don't explode publicly at first. They move privately. Phone calls happen, flights are booked quietly, legal advice is sought urgently. Institutions begin preparing, not for headlines, but for questions that can't be managed once they're asked formally. Somewhere in that chain of reactions, one name allegedly triggered concern strong enough to travel across the Atlantic. And that's when this story stopped being about reputation and started being about exposure. Understanding why requires understanding how Epstein's world actually functioned. It wasn't chaotic, it was structured. Ghislaine Maxwell was not simply present, she was a connector, a gatekeeper. She understood proximity, access, and placement. She knew who belonged in which rooms and why. Those environments weren't loud or documented. They were quiet, controlled, and intentionally untraceable. And that's why memory matters. Not everyone in those rooms committed crimes, but being present means witnessing dynamics that later become relevant. Memory doesn't disappear, it waits. And when testimony begins, waiting ends.
The environments where influence quietly circulates rarely look dangerous from the outside. They look curated, comfortable, even aspirational. Soho House is often described that way, a private members club designed for creatives, entrepreneurs, and people who prefer discretion over spectacle. Soft lighting, exclusive locations, the suggestion of importance without the noise of publicity, that's the surface. But beneath that surface, places like this function as corridors, not destinations, but passageways where different worlds intersect without documentation. Hollywood meets finance, politics brushes against entertainment, old money observes new ambition. These are not places where deals are signed, they're places where access is granted. And access, once given, reshapes trajectories quietly. Invitations aren't random. Presence is not accidental. People are selected not just for fame, but for utility, the right energy, the right look, the right ability to make a room feel alive before the people who truly matter arrive. Before palace balconies and royal titles, Meghan Markle moved through that corridor. According to accounts often repeated quietly rather than publicly, she traveled internationally for Soho House openings and private events, including high-profile locations like Istanbul. She wasn't billed as a headliner. She wasn't the draw. She occupied a role insiders understand well, someone meant to fill space, smooth interactions, and help an environment feel social rather than transactional. It's not a glamorous description, but it's a functional one. What drew attention later wasn't her presence, it was the scale and consistency of the lifestyle attached to it. International flights, luxury accommodations, repeated invitations. This wasn't a one-off opportunity, it was sustained access. At the time, she was a working actress on a cable television series. Comfortable, yes, but the kind of global movement being observed raised quiet questions. No accusations were made, no one confronted anyone. People simply noticed. And when something doesn't add up, the mind doesn't rush to judgment, it stores the detail. Memory is patient. It doesn't demand explanations immediately, it waits for context. Years later, when that same woman stands beside a prince, when her life is reframed as destiny rather than coincidence, those stored observations don't vanish. They rearrange themselves, not into certainty, but into relevance. This is where the narrative shifts from gossip to risk. Royal institutions understand this better than anyone. History doesn't disappear when a title is granted, it gets managed. Other royal families have faced similar situations. Princess Sofia of Sweden had a well-documented modeling and party past that faded from discussion once she became royal. Crown Princess Mette-Marit of Norway publicly acknowledged and apologized for poor judgment in maintaining a friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. The apology was issued, the matter closed, stability restored. This is how monarchy survives modern scrutiny, not by erasing the past, but by containing it. Silence becomes structure, ceremony becomes insulation. Once you recognize that pattern, Meghan's trajectory stops looking unique, it starts looking familiar, strategic, and that familiarity is exactly what makes new testimony dangerous, because systems built on silence only work until someone speaks under oath.
The moment a story shifts from observation to investigation, everything changes. Curiosity becomes liability. And this is where the narrative surrounding Meghan Markle stopped being about social circles and started brushing against legal gravity. During the civil case brought by Virginia Giuffre, the woman whose sworn testimony dismantled Prince Andrew's public standing, several names were evaluated quietly, not splashed across headlines, not announced in court, but reviewed behind the scenes by legal teams with subpoena power. Meghan Markle's name was reportedly among those considered, not as a defendant, but as a potential witness. That distinction matters more than people realize. Witnesses are not accused of crimes. They are people believed to have been present, adjacent, or aware of environments later proven dangerous. Being a witness doesn't imply guilt. It implies proximity. And proximity, in legal terms, is enough to justify questions. According to accounts surrounding the case, there were practical reasons her name surfaced. She resided in the United States, simplifying jurisdiction. She was described as more than a casual acquaintance of Prince Andrew during a specific period, and she had moved through the same elite social ecosystems where Jeffrey Epstein's activities were later exposed. Ultimately, she was not called to testify, but the significance wasn't in the outcome, it was in the process. Once investigators examine someone's history seriously enough to consider formal questioning, the risk profile changes permanently. This is exactly what happened with Prince Andrew. His downfall didn't come from tabloid speculation. It came from sworn testimony, from records, from the moment questions moved from rumor to courtroom. The royal family learned a brutal lesson from that collapse. Silence can protect for years, sometimes decades, but once legal scrutiny begins, silence loses its power. Prince Andrew became the example every royal institution now studies, proof that reputation management has limits, that once testimony enters the equation, public relations strategies dissolve. There is no walking back sworn statements. There is no rewriting court records. And that precedent looms large over this entire situation. Because if testimony expands beyond Andrew, if additional witnesses or documents emerge, proximity becomes unavoidable. This is where Prince Harry's actions take on a different meaning. His sudden return to the UK wasn't sentimental. It wasn't about reconciliation or healing. It was tactical. The royal institution he publicly condemned is the same institution built to survive scandals that escalate beyond gossip. They have legal frameworks, experienced advisors, and centuries of precedent for containing crises before they metastasize. Harry voluntarily walked away from that machinery. He criticized it, monetized his grievances, declared independence. But independence is a luxury when problems remain hypothetical. When testimony threatens to surface, independence becomes exposure. If Ghislaine Maxwell continues speaking, especially under oath or through formal cooperation, narratives will no longer be shaped by interviews or documentaries. They will be shaped by records. And that raises the final, unavoidable question. What did Harry know, and when did he know it? If he was aware of his wife's past and the risks attached to it, then his public denunciations look reckless. If he wasn't, then he married into a situation he didn't fully understand, one now threatening everything he tried to build outside royal protection. Either scenario ends the fairy tale. Because this was never about jealousy or tabloid cruelty. It was always about proximity, silence, and how long power can rely on both before the questions start demanding answers.
As those questions hover, the pressure no longer sits in the tabloids or comment sections. It moves into private conversations, closed doors, and decisions made without public explanation. This is the stage where stories stop being loud and start becoming dangerous, because once legal exposure is even possible, every past choice is re-examined through a new lens. Travel histories matter, associations matter, emails, messages, calendars, and introductions that once felt ordinary suddenly gain weight. According to observers close to institutional crisis management, this is the point where containment either happens early or fails completely. Prince Harry's return to the UK fits that pattern. Institutions don't need loyalty to function, they need proximity. Lawyers, advisors, and long-standing mechanisms work best when everyone is within reach. Distance complicates control. California doesn't offer the same insulation as royal protocol, and despite public narratives about independence, there is no private alternative structure capable of managing allegations that escalate beyond reputation and into legal inquiry. That is what makes the timing so striking. This move wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. Meanwhile, the images and moments once dismissed as harmless begin resurfacing with renewed scrutiny, not because they prove anything on their own, but because narratives under pressure invite reevaluation. Videos, photographs, old interviews, social connections, and unexplained gaps are replayed not for entertainment, but for coherence. When a story requires constant explanation to hold together, people begin asking why it needed reinforcement at all. In crisis dynamics, authenticity usually doesn't demand repetition. Performance does. This is also where silence starts working against those who relied on it. Silence protects when nothing challenges it. Once testimony, documents, or cooperation enter the picture, silence becomes conspicuous. Questions unanswered don't disappear, they multiply, and every refusal to engage becomes its own signal. According to legal analysts, the most damaging moment in any scandal isn't accusation, it's contradiction. When public narratives and private records no longer align, credibility fractures quickly. For Prince Harry, this creates a narrowing corridor. His public identity was built on truth-telling, exposure, and breaking silence. That positioning leaves little room to retreat when silence becomes necessary. The very arguments he used to separate himself from the royal family now limit his options. He cannot easily argue for privacy without undermining his own narrative, and the institution he rejected is the only one equipped to absorb the shock if things escalate.
This is why the story feels unfinished rather than explosive. Nothing has detonated yet, but all the ingredients for collapse are present: cooperation from a convicted insider, renewed legal attention to past environments, institutional memory that hasn't forgotten earlier scandals, and a prince who removed himself from the very system designed to contain them. When these elements align, outcomes stop being about control and start being about consequence. At this stage, no one needs to invent anything. The process runs on its own momentum. Questions lead to requests, requests lead to records, records lead to clarity, and clarity, whatever it reveals, is rarely pinned to stories built on managed silence. Whether nothing happens or everything does, the direction has already shifted. This is no longer a narrative fighting gossip. It is a narrative waiting on facts, and facts do not respond to reputation, intention, or image. They respond only to evidence. The final stage of stories like this is never loud. It is quiet, procedural, and deeply unsettling for those involved. When narratives reach this point, no statement can reset them. No interview can soften them. Momentum no longer belongs to the people at the center. It belongs to institutions, records, and timelines that do not bend to emotion. This is where power shifts away from image and toward verification, and that shift is irreversible. For Prince Harry, this moment represents a collision between two identities he tried to keep separate: the rebel who rejected the system and the prince who still carries its consequences. The system does not forget. It archives, it catalogs, it remembers every association, every introduction, every overlap. When pressure builds, those archives do not exist to protect individuals, they exist to protect continuity. That is why returning to the UK was never about reconciliation. It was about positioning himself near the only structure capable of absorbing fallout without collapsing. Meanwhile, the public side of the story continues to feel strangely hollow. No clear denials, no decisive explanations, just distance, distraction, and carefully worded absences. In isolation, that might mean nothing. In context, it signals calculation. Silence is being measured, not accidental, because once statements are made, they become part of the record, and records live longer than headlines. What makes this situation uniquely fragile is that it sits at the intersection of celebrity culture and institutional consequence. Celebrity scandals burn hot and fade fast. Institutional scandals move slowly and never truly disappear. The moment legal mechanisms become even hypothetically involved, timelines stretch, memory deepens, stakes rise. This is no longer about who people like or dislike. It's about who was present, who knew what, and when silence stopped being enough. And this is where the story leaves the realm of narrative control entirely. Because if nothing emerges, the silence will still have changed everything. It will confirm that protection was necessary. If something does emerge, the confirmation becomes formal. Either way, the image that once relied on clarity now survives only through ambiguity. That is not stability. That is suspension. Prince Harry's future, and by extension Meghan's, now sits in that suspension, not condemned, not cleared, simply waiting. Waiting for whether testimony expands, waiting for whether cooperation deepens, waiting for whether institutions decide containment is possible or correction is required. This waiting is the most uncomfortable phase of all, because outcomes are no longer influenced by charisma, sympathy, or storytelling. They are influenced by process, and process does not care about fairy tales. It cares about alignment, about whether stories match records, about whether timelines agree with documentation, about whether silence was chosen for privacy or necessity. When those answers arrive, they will not arrive dramatically. They will arrive definitively. That is why this story does not end with outrage or vindication. It ends with clarity, whatever that clarity looks like. And clarity, once delivered, cannot be negotiated. It can only be accepted. Until then,
The silence speaks louder than anything else ever could.